video today is going to be discussing how I read the Bible. The Bible is a collection of books from dozens of different authors spanning thousands of years. It can be difficult to read at first, but I'm going to lay out how I find it helpful to capture a larger view of the whole Bible. First off, let me say that there are different approaches to interpreting the Bible. The most popular one is an exegetical approach. That is trying to understand what the human author knew at the time he wrote the book. That's certainly a fine approach, just not the one I take. I take the whole Bible as one complete story being inspired by God himself. When I look at a passage or even a book, I wonder what God was thinking or doing when he inspired the human author to write what he did. To me, this approach captures the larger point of view, or the 30,000-foot level, when understanding what is going on. When I first started to read the Bible, and Genesis in particular, I saw sin enter the world through Adam and Eve. But while God was cursing Satan, he foreshadowed something.
So the Lord said to the serpent, "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all cattle, and more than every beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." That last line got me. The serpent was going to bruise the heel of the seed from the woman. I was no biblical scholar, but I knew that Jesus had died on the cross and nails were driven into his feet, thus fulfilling this verse that was written way back in Genesis. So if God could prophesize what would happen back at the Garden of Eden, then he would either guide the story to get to that point or saw how it would unfold and happen. God was obviously omniscient, but certainly he was also prescient. He could see everything, including the future.
So if he knew how it would end, then he knew how people would act and the decisions they would make. So with this outlook on the overall story, I decided it would be helpful to read the Bible as one complete book and in chronological order as the events happen. Some may not know this, the Bible's not in chronological order. This video will put the books and thus the events in order for you to do a linear cover to cover, better absorbing the overall story.
There is a difference in Bibles, but I'm an ecumenical person. I'm going to list all the books that both Protestants and Catholics have. Protestant Bibles have 66 books, while Catholics have 73. I'm going to list all 73 so everyone will know the order. I play no favorites here. I just want everyone to know the order. So if I list a book that isn't in your Bible, then don't worry, that book is in someone else's. The first book of the Bible is, of course, Genesis. This book takes you from creation, then sin entering the world, until God chooses a people, the Israelites, who go down to Egypt. Right away, I interject a different book that is not in order. I read the book of Job here. Now, Job is a poetic book that has deep, significant meaning on suffering and faith in God's plan behind it all. But the setting of Job has it occurring during Genesis, so I tend to read it here before we get to the next narrative book. The next one to read is an important foundational book. It's Exodus and the time of Moses. This takes God's people, the Israelites, from slavery in Egypt to being freed and into the desert at Mount Sinai, where God starts to lead his people. The next book is a tough one to read for the novice or even the average reader. It's the Book of Leviticus. This book takes place while the Israelites are still at Mount Sinai, and God is giving his laws to Moses to govern his people. It can be a difficult read for most. This one's going to take some time to understand. Then we come to the Book of Numbers. This book is set while the people are still at Mount Sinai, but we see them start to move from there in order for the Israelites to get to their promised land. They get there, but are afraid of the people, and God sentences that grumbling generation to wander 40 years in the wilderness. Then Deuteronomy is next. We see the Israelites are back before the promised land, and we get more laws, warnings from God to stay faithful, and the death of Moses. The first 5 narrative books, omitting Job, are called the Torah, or the Pentateuch. Next in line is the Book of Joshua, which is an action-packed book about the battles that happened while the Israelites came into the Promised Land, and also how that Promised Land is allotted to the 12 tribes of Israel. Then we come to the Book of Judges and start seeing the problems the Israelite people have following God. This is where we fit in another book in between the narrative books. I like to read the Book of Ruth here, as this is where the setting would occur during the time of Judges. The Book of Ruth is a wonderful love story with lots of deep meaning.
Now is when it starts to get tricky at keeping the books in order. You have the narrative books in the beginning of the kingdom, but you also have the corresponding set of narratives from the books of the Chronicles, which tells some of the stories not seen in the narrative books, but also enhances some details retold from the narrative books. I tend to go back and forth between the two to see stories from two different angles.
At this point, I start with 1 Chronicles 1 through 7, which lists the genealogies of Adam and the Israelites. Then I like to get back to the narrative books and read the whole book of 1 Samuel 1 through 31, which details the story of the prophet Samuel until the first king Saul and his rivalry with David. I like to come back and read 1 Chronicles 8 through 10, which captures Saul's genealogy and his death. Now we get to the story of the great King David and his reign. 2 Samuel 1 through 5 will take us from the first story of David's rule until he takes Jerusalem as his capital. Then we go back to 1 Chronicles 11 through 12 for that version of the same story. Now from there, we go to the story of the Ark of the Covenant, which housed the 10 Commandments. We read 2 Samuel 6 and then read 1 Chronicles 13 through 16 for more details about the Ark and its journey. The next story is about God's covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7 and also repeated in 1 Chronicles 17. Then we hear about David's other battles in 2 Samuel 8 through 10 and also again in 1 Chronicles 18 through 20. Then we start getting into the story of David and his children all the way to the census that is told in 2 Samuel 11 through 24. The Book of Chronicles tells the story of the census in 1 Chronicles 21 all the way to David preparing the temple materials in 1 Chronicles 28. Then we get to the next set of narrative books in 1 Kings 1 through 2 that tells the story of the last rebellious son of David before his son Solomon takes over, and David's death. Then we hear about David's death again in 1 Chronicles 29. This is when I like to read the Book of Psalms. I usually don't like to split up the non-narrative books, so I read them after the storylines have ended. I read the whole Book of Psalms right here, which are largely attributed to David. 1 Kings 3 tells the story of Solomon requesting wisdom, while 2 Chronicles 1 tells the same story. 1 Kings 4 through 11 is when King Solomon starts to build the first temple of God. 2 Chronicles 2 through 9 also tells the story of Solomon and the temple until his death. After this is where we start getting to the books largely attributed to Solomon. We read Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, and Wisdom. Wisdom is one of the books that only Catholics have. Here's where it gets really complicated as the kingdom divides into two, and both the northern and southern kingdoms elect new kings and their stories. We start in 1 Kings 12 through 14 to read about Rehoboam and Jeroboam, and then read 2 Chronicles 10 through 12 to read these stories also. Then we read in 1 Kings 15 about a few kings including Abijah and Asa, then go back to 2 Chronicles 13 through 16 to read about Asa and Baasha again. Then we stay with the Book of Kings for a little bit and read 1 Kings 16 through 22. These chapters will introduce Jehu and tell the story of the prophet Elijah and a particularly bad king Ahab. Chapter 22 ends with Jehoshaphat. This is when we get to 2 Chronicles 17 through 20 to see the stories of Ahab and Jehoshaphat again. We get to 2 Kings 1 through 8 to discuss Elisha, who succeeds Elijah as prophet, and gets to the stories of Kings Joram and Ahaziah. Then we read 2 Chronicles 21 through 22 for their stories of Jehoram, Ahaziah, and begin to introduce Queen Athaliah. Then we get into some good stories about Jehu and Queen Athaliah in 2 Kings 9 through 11, and then read about her again in 2 Chronicles 23. We read about Joash in 2 Kings 12, and then again in 2 Chronicles 24. The next couple of chapters in 2 Kings 13 through 14 talk about the death of Elisha and King Amaziah, which we read about also in 2 Chronicles 25. Now is where we start inserting some other books. God knew that both the northern and southern kingdoms were going astray, the northern especially, so he started to send more prophets to his people. At this point, I read the books of Amos, Jonah, and Hosea as they correlate to the time period in the narrative books. Then we get to 2 Kings 15 that talks about 7 different kings, then come back to 2 Chronicles 26 through 27 to read about Uzziah and Jotham. We read about King Ahaz in 2 Kings 16 and 2 Chronicles 28. Then here's an important reflection point as we read 2 Kings 17 and how the northern kingdom is taken into exile by Assyria. Then we insert the books of Tobit and Nahum, books after the exile. Tobit is another book from Catholic Bibles. Then we get into an important king, Hezekiah in 2 Kings 18 through 20. And you're going to see a major prophet mentioned, Isaiah. We read 2 Chronicles 29 through 32 for this version of the stories. Then we get into some prophetic books, including the books of Isaiah, Micah, and Joel. I like to read these right after Hezekiah, so the stories will be fresh in my mind. Then back to 2 Kings 21 and the story of Manasseh, and to 2 Chronicles 33 for the same. 2 Kings 22 through 23 for the story of Josiah, and over to 2 Chronicles 34 to 35 for his same story. We insert and read the book of Zephaniah at this point. We are approaching the end of the southern kingdom, so we read 2 Kings 24 for 3 of the last kings of Judah. This is when I like to insert Jeremiah, Baruch, and Habakkuk, right before the southern kingdom's exile. Then come back to finish off the narrative books of 2 Kings 25 and 2 Chronicles 36 at how the end comes to Jerusalem and the southern kingdom. We finish the end of the Old Testament and try to read in this order: Lamentations, Obadiah, Daniel, Ezekiel, Judith, Ezra, Haggai, Zechariah, Esther, Nehemiah, Malachi, Maccabees 1, Maccabees 2, Sirach. Remember, I've included books from the Catholic versions of the Bible here. You might not have some of these in your Bible. So that is the Old Testament, and then we come to the New Testament. The 4 Gospels can be read in any order. I don't like breaking them up, even though they can be placed in a chronological order. I usually start and read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then save John for last. Then we read about the beginning of the church in the book of Acts. Now, when we get to the epistles, it really doesn't matter what order you read these in. You can read all the epistles as they are listed from beginning to the end. Or you can follow the travels of Paul. 1 and 2 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Romans, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Philemon, Hebrews, Titus, 1 and 2 Timothy. Then finish up the Bible with Jude, James, 1 and 2 Peter, then the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of John's letters. Of course, I save Revelation for last when we see how Jesus defeats Satan at the end.
This is how I like to read the Bible, as a cover-to-cover, seeing and comprehending one complete story that is told in chronological order. You'll have to make yourself some kind of guide to make sure you can follow the narratives between the different books. I feel this is the best way in order to see not only the linear story from God's point of view, but to see some of the aspects from stories that are retold in different books. I'm in a constant cover-to-cover reading of the Bible. It is the living word, and you're going to get more out of it every time you read it. And remember, Peter called Jesus the author of life. This is his beautiful story, and it all connects perfectly. Jesus wins in the end, and then we can be with God for eternity. I hope this helps. God bless you all.